All right, so we've talked about controlling alcohol availability. We've talked about controlling prescription drugs, or at least the triangle of prescription drugs and how they make their way from the manufacturers to the patient. So now let's talk about controlling illicit drugs, illegal drugs, and controlling the supply of them. So illegal drugs, hopefully not surprising, follow the basic idea of supply and demand. So when there's a large supply of them and there's a low demand of them, they're relatively cheap and easy to get. When there's a low supply, there typically is high demand, and that means that they're higher cost. That's the basic principle of supply and demand. And what most illicit drug control policies do, whether they're direct policies or indirect policies, is try to limit the supply. So they're limiting the supply. They might increase demand, but they're ultimately trying to increase cost. Now again, I mentioned that there are direct and indirect control policies. Direct control policies are things like prohibition. We simply ban the use, the possession, the selling of any product, a certain substance in general. And this tends to be really effective. It pulls a open network, an open marketplace in essentially to a black market behind the scenes, behind the curtains, and it makes it much harder for people to get the substances that they're interested in. And it also requires minimal enforcement. Essentially, anybody can help enforce and point out when these drugs are being sold or when they're being used. You don't need necessarily this full-on active, engaged process. Although there are some unintended consequences of prohibitions and some of these control policies in general, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. Another direct supply control policies is banning precursor chemicals. So a lot of illegal substances require certain chemicals to be turned into the illegal substance. So methamphetamine is the one that comes to mind now. One of the precursor chemicals of them appears in the over-the-counter medication of Sudafed. Now, Sudafed isn't itself banned, but we do limit how much one individual can purchase, making it much harder for manufacturers of methamphetamine to actually get enough product to make enough drug to meet supply. Again, that makes sure both prohibition and this banning of precursor chemicals ensures that the price of the end drug, the illicit drug that's actually being sold and used, remains relatively high. Other direct control policies or direct supply control policies include source country control. So here we're actually going into the countries where the products or the drugs are actually grown and they're actually made, like initially made, and we're trying to limit the amount of these raw materials available for manufacture. So we can eradicate the crops, or we can do alternative development programs, essentially giving farmers an incentive to use more general accepted crops like corn or soybeans rather than growing illicit substances. We also use interdiction. So we prevent these illegal drugs from being exported from the producer countries. We prevent them from being imported into the consumer countries. So if you hear on the news that there's this big drug bust, it's the largest drug bust in the history, largest drug bust in the last 20 years. We've captured 100 kilos of heroin or 25 kilos of cocaine. That is interdiction. That is intercepting the product as it's leaving a producer country or before it enters a consumer country. Now, I mentioned before there's indirect drug supply control policies. The goals of these indirect programs are to increase the amount of time it takes for someone to find the drug they're interested in, and again, increase cost. That's a common theme between the direct and the indirect drugs. So some of these, one of the indirect supply control policies is retail enforcement. So we arrest and jail the people who traffic drugs, the distributors, the suppliers. If you are a seller of drugs, we will put you in jail. And this, again, it works hand in hand with prohibition. So we're converting these open drug markets where it's very easy to find, very easy to get, into these covert drug markets where you have to actually seek out the person and they have to hide in the process because they don't want to end up in jail. There's greater risk involved in these covert drug markets, which ultimately make availability lower and cost higher. Another indirect way to control illicit drugs is through sentencing. So once we catch you, what do we do with you? Now, this depends on the offense. Are you just possessing it versus are you distributing it? So distribution tends to have higher penalties. It depends on the substance. One of the prime examples here in the United States is cocaine versus crack cocaine. And crack cocaine has much, much harsher sentencing than cocaine itself, up to 10 times longer in jail, which has led to some social consequences. And it's also dependent on the country. So here in the United States, we seem to be relaxing our drug laws. We're legalizing marijuana, so it, in a few years it may no longer even be mentioned in this slide set. We're at the very least reducing it to a misdemeanor, so it's a fine rather than jail time for possession of it. We're also reducing the number of years someone might be in jail for distributing or possession of other illicit drugs. Again, we found that's here in the United States, longer sentencing didn't actually have many good outcomes or worth the outcomes that we were getting. But other countries are the complete reverse. So the Philippines is literally having a war on drugs. Their President Duterte is authorizing the essentially illegal killings of thousands of drug users and drug dealers on the streets. No trials, no arrests. They're just kind of killing them in their homes. Places like Singapore, where has very strict sentencing, where possession of drug use can result in a death sentence. It's slightly better than the Philippines because at least you get a trial, but it is a death sentence. And then I mentioned that there are some social concerns between the different sentencing. So cocaine versus crack cocaine, for instance. Crack cocaine is much more used by the African American population compared to cocaine. So by having harsher sentencing for crack cocaine, you're not only putting more African Americans in jail, disproportionately large of African Americans in jail, but you're putting them in jail for longer than you would someone who's a cocaine user who's more likely to be Caucasian. Now, new psychoactive substances are a little bit different. So typical illicit drugs who fall under the policies of things like interdiction or of harsh sentencing guidelines are kind of traditional substances. They are cocaine, they're heroin, they are the amphetamines. But psychoactive substances are more like the fad drugs. They're like bath salts. You hear about them for a little bit, but then they kind of fade away because something new comes along. And what ends up happening is that these are new drugs because they're allowed until they're explicitly banned. Now, some countries do the worst, and basically everything's banned unless they get an exemption. But typically, they're allowed unless they're banned. And they're only banned once it kind of comes to light, enough people use them, and there's enough dangerous consequences of them to get noticed. And I say that these are different because they use different distribution networks. These aren't being manufactured overseas in Colombia or Afghanistan and having these very elaborate distribution networks across oceans and continents and all these international players. It's simply different. It could be much more local. It could still be far apart, but the cartels and the manufacturers and distributors for the cocaines and heroines of the world are different than the manufacturers, distributors, and sellers of these new psychoactive substances. Now, the common theme among all direct and indirect drug control policies are that they require significant resources. It takes a lot of money to put most of these things in place, with the exception of maybe prohibition, where you just kind of put it all out there. Highly publicized events, so those big drug busts, we've seized 100 kilograms of cocaine last week, don't really have much effect. It's actually a very small amount of illicit drugs that enter the market in any particular country, so you're not actually increasing demand, you're not actually lowering supply all that much, and you don't really impact cost. And there's really not a lot of evidence that most of these policies work. There's not a lot of evidence that interdiction works. There's not a lot of evidence, even though it seems logical, that source country control efforts work. So eradicating all of the poppy plants in a country don't seem to reduce the heroin supply all that much. But when they do say something is successful, you have to ask what is being measured. Are you measuring the process? So how much is being seized? How many crops were being eradicated? Or are you actually measuring the outcome? How much drugs are actually still on the market? How many people are actually using it? How many overdoses have occurred in a given area of time? And while there have been some successes when you're looking at these outcome evaluations where it's actual drug use or actual consequences of use, they seem to require a very unique set of circumstances that are hard to replicate over time. And finally, I mentioned that there are some unintended consequences of these drug control policies. And these unintended consequences typically include increases in violence, increases in crime, and a depletion of resources from other areas that we might be interested in. Now, the crime in general, that seems to be a fairly obvious one. Just because you're banning something, you're making it illegal, so anybody who's still going to try to use it is ultimately committing a crime. But the depletion of resources might be the most insidious, because things like interdiction and source supply control take a lot of money. They take a lot of manpower. So if you're in a position to make these types of decisions, you need to be really careful on what you're going to do to get the most benefit for the limited availability of money and manpower you have available.